They didn't have hospitals, no antibiotics, no stethoscopes, no germ theory, and yet some of the most complex surgeries in the ancient world were performed in Egypt thousands of years before anyone in Europe even understood what a brain was. That's not a theory, that's documented. And it raises a question most people never actually stop to ask. What did they know that we think we invented? Here's what almost nobody talks about when they discuss ancient Egypt. We spend so much time on the pyramids, the pharaohs, the afterlife, but there are documents, actual papyrus scrolls that describe in detail how Egyptian healers treated skull fractures, dislocated shoulders, infected wounds, tumors, depression. One of them is over 3,500 years old, and it reads more like a modern surgical manual than anything you'd expect from a civilization that supposedly didn't have medicine. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, named after the American who bought it in 1862, describes 48 specific cases of injury, mostly to the head and neck. And for each one, it records the examination, the diagnosis, the prognosis, and the treatment. No magic, no spells, just observations. That detail is important because what you find in almost every other ancient medical text, including other Egyptian ones, is a world saturated with ritual and incantation. But not this one. This one reads like a rational mind trying to understand the body through evidence. That's not supposed to exist in 1600 BC. So the question isn't whether Egyptians had medicine. They clearly did. The real question is, how did they figure it out? This is where it gets interesting. Mummification. When you think about embalming, you probably think about religion, preserving the body for the afterlife. And that's accurate, but it's only half the story. The process of mummification gave Egyptian healers something almost no civilization of that era had. Direct, regular, hands-on experience with the interior of the human body. Every major organ was removed, examined, handled. The lungs, the liver, the stomach, the intestines, all carefully extracted, treated, and placed into canopic jars. Over generations of this practice, patterns emerged. Understanding developed. Not formal anatomy in the way we'd recognize it today, but something real, something functional. The Ebers Papyrus, a 110-page medical scroll from around 1550 BCE, describes the circulatory system with surprising accuracy. It identifies the heart as the center of the blood supply, with vessels extending to every part of the body. It covers diabetes, arthritis, gynecology, burns, contraception, even a short section on what we would now recognize as depression. 110 pages, over 700 remedies. Most people completely miss how far ahead that is. But this is where it gets strange. The same civilization that produced what is essentially a surgical textbook also believed that illness was caused by evil spirits, by the anger of gods, by disruptions in invisible channels running through the body, and their response to that wasn't to choose between science and religion. They combined them, deliberately. Egyptian physicians called Swnw would recite incantations while applying medicine, not because they were confused, but because in their framework, the illness had both a physical and a spiritual dimension, and treating only one was incomplete. Herodotus, the Greek historian, wrote in around 450 BCE that Egyptian medicine was already so specialized that each physician treated only one disease, one doctor for the eyes, one for the teeth, one for the stomach. That's not folk medicine. That's specialization. And here's the part almost nobody connects to what comes next. Greek medicine, the medicine of Hippocrates. The medicine that most Western doctors trace their tradition back to was directly influenced by Egypt. The Greeks knew it. Hippocrates himself reportedly spent time studying in Egypt. Several ancient sources describe Egyptian medical thought as foundational to what later became Western medicine. So when you hear that modern medicine begins in ancient Greece, you're hearing half a story. Now here's the shift. Because it would be easy at this point to conclude that Egyptian medicine was essentially rational, just expressed in a more spiritual language. But that's probably not accurate either. When you look closely at some of the treatments in the Ebers Papyrus, you find remedies that don't make scientific sense and probably never did. Animal fats mixed with questionable herbs. Treatments involving substances that no modern pharmacologist would defend. And yet, running alongside those are remedies that do work, that have been validated by modern research. Honey, for example. Egyptian medical writings reference honey in nearly 500 recipes. They used it on wounds, on burns, on infected cuts, and it turns out honey contains hydrogen peroxide, released slowly when it contacts a moist wound. It creates an acidic, low water environment where bacteria cannot survive. It has genuine antibacterial properties. They didn't know why it worked, but they knew that it worked. Generation after generation, they observed the result and kept using it, and that raises a deeply uncomfortable question. How much of what they believed was wrong, but still produced correct outcomes? What if you don't need to understand a mechanism to discover it? What if thousands of years of careful observation, passed from healer to healer, created something that looks like intuition, but is actually accumulated data? There are researchers today who argue that a significant portion of traditional medicine across ancient cultures was effective not because of belief, but because of trial and error at a civilizational scale. Failures were forgotten. Successes were recorded, repeated, refined. The Ebers Papyrus itself may be a copy of earlier texts. Medical information in the Edwin Smith Papyrus has been traced back to 3000 BCE, meaning some of that knowledge is potentially 5,000 years old. Think about what that means. These weren't individual breakthroughs, they were the result of centuries of practice, observation, and documentation, and yet modern medicine rediscovered most of it from scratch, acting for much of history as if nothing useful had come before. At what point does that become its own kind of strange? There's a theory among some medical historians that the real loss wasn't what Egyptians didn't know. It was what was lost when their civilization ended. The Library of Alexandria, whatever it actually contained, represented the accumulated knowledge of a culture that had been writing things down for thousands of years. When it burned, when the culture fragmented, when the knowledge stopped being transmitted, Europe entered centuries of medical regression. People in medieval Europe were dying of infections that Egyptian physicians had been treating successfully 2,000 years earlier. Honey was forgotten. Copper-based antiseptics were forgotten. Surgical techniques that the Egyptians had documented were abandoned in favor of prayer. The knowledge didn't disappear because it was wrong. It disappeared because the system that transmitted it collapsed. If you stayed with this long enough to get here, you're probably already thinking about what that implies. So here's where we actually land. Either Egyptian medicine was a remarkable coincidence, a culture stumbling onto effective treatments for reasons that had nothing to do with rigorous understanding, and we should be careful about reading too much into it, or something else is true, that the line between observation and science is thinner than we think, that rigorous knowledge can emerge without the formal institutions we associate with it, that civilizations we've categorized as ancient and pre-scientific may have understood certain things about the body through sheer accumulated experience that took the Western tradition 2,000 years to independently rediscover. Neither of those possibilities is fully comfortable. The first one asks you to accept that a lot of what worked in antiquity was luck. The second one asks you to accept that we lost something real and spent centuries not knowing it was gone. Which of those two things do you think is more likely? Most people never sit with that question. If you're the kind of person who does, who looks at what we think we know and keeps pulling on the thread, you're already paying attention to a different layer of history than most people ever reach.